also, Steve informed us that this is going to be posted to YouTube. So if you know anyone who wanted to come look good, that they can watch it there. All right. So hello, if you haven't met me, my name is Hugo, and I'm not going to tell you my pronouns. So if you already know them, don't tell them. There's a reason for this.
All right, let's try that again. Okay.
Yay!
So my name is James Oliver. I will also not be telling you my pronouns. If you think you know them, don't tell anyone. So we'd like to start off today's workshop with a question for you to talk about together. So what are some ways that you think you can show support for trans people in your everyday life? So go ahead, talk to each other, and we'll take a couple of answers in the big group in like 2 minutes, minute or two.
Yeah, go ahead.
What are some ways you think you can show support for trans people in your everyday life?
All right. Real quick, let's come on back. Does anyone have any answers they want to share? What's up?
Oh, we've got a mic coming for you.
I had a hard time because I thought, if I was trans and people came up to me and wanted to ask me questions, I'd want to educate them. But maybe not everyone who's trans would be comfortable with me coming up and asking them questions. So then I thought maybe I should, if I meet them, I could ask them what their pronouns are. But again, I just kind of felt lost because I didn't know what to do. So I don't think that helps, but.
Yeah, that's a good one. We can talk about that during the Q&A at the end, because that's a good question.
As someone who works in education, I put my pronouns in my email signature so that people feel comfortable telling me what their pronouns are.
Yeah, and kind of on a related note, we just kind of talked about anytime you meet a new person, when you introduce yourselves, just always say your pronouns, because it doesn't really matter if you're like with a trans person or not, or if someone has the pronouns you assume, like it's better to just say than not assume. So Amelia, she, her, and then continue the conversation.
Anybody else? It's important to not, to remember to purposefully think of other words that are inclusive to everybody, instead of saying ladies and gentlemen, say something like everyone or all, everyone here or something. I don't know, I can't think of anything else. But people, yes, that's a good one. Yeah, there we go.
All right. So there are a lot of great ways to show your support for trans people, and a lot of you talked about pronouns. And yeah, one of the most simple and common ways is to use the correct name and pronouns for them. So, real quick, pause. Who can give me the elementary school definition of pronouns?
Teacher.
Yeah, come on.
We have a teacher over here?
If you can't give it, I can give it. We're going back to school. I'm a teacher. All right, so the way I think of pronouns is just as a placeholder. They take the place of a noun, so person, place, or thing, or idea. So they take the place of a noun in a sentence. So when I'm talking about myself, I or me are placeholders for my name. Technically, Hugo could use Hugo's name in every sentence Hugo says, but that sounds kind of weird and off-putting, especially because Hugo sounds like Hugo is talking about someone else. It sounds a lot more natural when I use those placeholders for my name. And then this extends to talking about anyone or anything outside of myself. Some examples of pronouns are it, she, he, they, this. We found out those is a pronoun earlier today, so we had to keep that in mind. So, yeah. Okay, so now let's talk about how this impacts social interactions. So we use pronouns every day without even thinking about it, To demonstrate it, the first paragraph alone of our script had 15 pronouns in it. So why does this matter? English sometimes, not all the time, uses gendered pronouns. mostly when you're referring to like someone else. If I'm talking to James Oliver about Reverend Mandy's like reflection today, without thinking, I'll say something like, her reflection today was interesting. I really liked the part where she talked about whatever. I've used 2 gender pronouns in that sentence to refer to Mandy.
So what do someone's pronouns tell you about them? Especially someone you just met or haven't met yet. It's not a trick question. Talk to each other real quick. What do someone's pronouns tell you about them?
That's not the most important part about me. So,
All right. Let's come back together. What do someone's pronouns tell you about them?
So does anybody have an answer? What do you think someone's pronouns tell you about them?
Oh, you want the mic? Right up here.
We decided that pronouns tell us gender.
That's an answer. And we'll get to that.
I was kind of thinking that unfortunately they tell us a lot of stereotypes as a society.
Yep. All right.
We had one more.
Oh, one more? Cool.
We discussed the possibility that pronouns tell us nothing at all about individuals. And we talked about women who normally identify, or who identify as women but don't necessarily want to be treated like a woman in a specific context, or just treated differently than a man would be treated in the same context, might feel some tension about how to identify there.
I like that answer. It's very what we're going to talk about.
So now what if you're talking to a friend after the service and she says something like, oh man, I met a new person earlier and they sat next to me during the service. They hadn't been here before, so I got to chat with them about who we are as a church, and they seemed interested in coming back, so that was pretty cool. I'll introduce you to them when they're here again. What does the use of those pronouns tell you, the they, them pronouns? Take a moment to talk to each other about that. Okay, so let's take 1 or 2 answers. What do you think those uses of the they, them pronouns about that person that your friend just met tells you about that person?
I have a question about they, them. So in my head, is it ever correct to use it as like because you prefer to think as like a collective or like a community type of, if you're a person that uses maybe that type of thought process? Oh, I'm sorry. I was just asking about they, them, and whether or not it's appropriate to say or to use that as a pronoun if you're maybe an individual that tries to think as like a collective, and that's just how you approach maybe your thought process.
Yeah, that's totally appropriate, if that's how you feel.
Anybody else?
Well, we kind of talked about similar to what Jack was saying. Like, it doesn't really tell you what the person, like a lot about the person at all. Like, and that's kind of a lot of times why we use they, them pronouns about people we don't know. Or if there's a situation, like Chris gave the example of like if you found something, like I wonder, like what did they mean by this, or like whatever. If you don't know who did something, yeah, I think people tend to like, when we're in this kind of context of like talking about pronouns, people are like they, them, like that's new, but like it's not. Like that's a pretty normal way to be like, oh, like they had a coffee or whatever. Like it doesn't have to be like a big thing.
Well, it takes the focus off the gender and puts it on the person, and that they're interested in our church, which is really what really matters.
Sorry.
Well, my first reaction would be if somebody talked to me like that, because of my background, because I hadn't been to this morning forum yet, I would right away want to know, is it a man or a woman? Because that's so instinctive to me. It's like, I can't help myself. I need to know.
All right, so kind of like Amelia's answer, the answer is nothing necessarily. The person certainly could be non-binary. If you don't know what that means, they don't identify as a man or a woman. Or perhaps they just didn't specify, and so your friend just used they, them. They, them in the singular is gender neutral, meaning it doesn't tell you anything specific about that person's gender necessarily.
It can take some people a little time to get used to the singular they, them, as a lot of people are most familiar with they being used to describe a group, rather than just one person. But they, them can be used in the singular, and it's actually common in situations when you're talking about someone whose gender you don't know. If a parent walks by with a stroller and a baby in it, it would be pretty normal to say, "Aw, your baby is so cute. Are they a boy or a girl?" And then switching to he or she upon learning if it's a boy or a girl. But beyond that, they, them has been used in the singular for a very long time. One of my personal favorite examples is people often use the singular they when angrily referring to another driver whose pronouns is unknown. For example, why wouldn't they just use their turn signal? It may take some time to get used to using it regularly and with thought instead of thoughtlessly being angry about someone not using their turn signal. But it's an important piece of language to be aware of. Another linguistic situation to consider is when you might use the phrase he or she. Think to yourself, does the phrase he or she best fit this situation, or does the singular they include everyone I mean to include? He or she limits the people included in the phrase to those that use those pronouns, while the use of the singular they allows for you to refer to a singular individual within a group of individuals using different pronouns. That way, not only are you referring to people who use he or she pronouns, but also all of the other pronouns too.
And it's just a little less clunky than he or she. It's less syllables. So often though, we are referring to a specific individual with a specific set of pronouns that includes he or she. Even with gendered pronouns, like he or she, it's important to think about them more deeply. If you meet someone and they introduce themselves with pronouns that don't necessarily match your initial impression of them, it is important to put the effort into not only change the pronouns you use for that person, but how you think about them. They're trying to communicate something to you and others through their pronouns. Trans people deserve to feel safe and welcome, especially in a space like this. If you don't use their correct pronouns, they might feel uncomfortable or like people aren't making an effort to accept them.
Let's take a moment to ponder the importance of pronouns. First, talk with the people around you about why you think pronouns can be so important. What makes them such a foundational aspect of interacting with trans people? So why are the pronouns important for trans people specifically?
All right. I love the discussions people are having. This makes me very, very happy. Does anyone want to say why they think pronouns are important? Yeah, sure.
Only if you have the microphone. Okay. I'm here because I'm not comfortable. I don't know how to approach trans persons. So this may sound, I don't know how it's going to come across. But
no stupid questions.
Okay. By your by naming yourselves, that gives me a clue as to your gender identification. Now, that may not be right, but I'm going to ask the question anyway.
Okay.
Does that, by choosing James Oliver and Hugo, does that give me insight as to your gender identification? That's my question.
That's an excellent question.
I love that question. That just made me so happy.
No, that's a really good question, actually. So, I usually, when trans people come up with their names, there's a lot of reasons for it. I've known people who just name themselves after objects. and it's really fun. But yeah, so sometimes it might be like a gender neutral name even. It can be kind of tricky with me specifically. We're going to talk about my gender identity very soon.
In like 3 paragraphs or something, I think.
It's okay. We're getting there. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
So how do you figure out
Just assume that it's not a clue, I'd say.
Just assume it's not?
Yes.
So, okay. I want to say a couple of things to that. So, think about a quilt. A quilt. Okay. So imagine this beautiful quilt, right? And for cisgender people, imagine that this quilt is this design that you were given when you were born, right? And you liked that design when you were born, and so you stick with it. And you have this quilt design, and you make this quilt throughout your life, and you're given parts of this design throughout your life, and you keep these designs, and you keep those designs throughout your life, and you make that quilt, right? So you keep your name, you keep your pronouns, all that stuff. You wear the skirts or the dresses or whatever, or maybe you change it a little bit, and you don't wear skirts or dresses, but you adjust that quilt to what fits your needs, right? To make your own beautiful quilt. With trans people, they kind of make their own beautiful quilt in a different way. They see this design that they were given at birth, and they go, this quilt doesn't fit me quite right. I don't know how much of this I actually like. And they say to themselves, I'm going to change this, that, and the next thing. I want this quilt to be exactly what I want. So for me, changing my name was saying, I like this name for X, Y, and Z reasons. And a big thing in the trans community, I've had many trans friends who have made a Google Doc. This is like a super fun thing. And you and your friends will make a Google Doc of names that you all like and help your friend pick out a name. It's super fun. Not all people do this, but some trans people will, as a community, pick out a name for someone. And they get final say on their name, of course, because it's their quilt that they're making, right? It's their beautiful quilt of gender that they're making. But they have community helping them and supporting them along the way and helping them pick that design, if that makes sense. I don't know if that was helpful. It was a little bit of a metaphor.
But I'm just thinking, because of what Bob said, and I'm not going to tell you my age. Okay? And I'm just used to the male, female. And people dress, and I have all kinds of clues. And so this doesn't help me then. I mean, it makes it harder to figure out your quilt, and I want to be respectful, and I'll say, this might lead to my not approaching either of you because I'm not sure who you are and figuring it out. So this is very helpful, but I'm still not getting enough clues. Because what you're saying is the names don't necessarily flow from what you're identifying as.
Here's another question. I have a question for you. Okay. So, does someone's gender or gender identity or sex assigned at birth necessarily tell you anything about them that, does it tell you about their character necessarily?
It doesn't tell me about their character, but it does give me some, it's not character, but it does give me some clues for what my conversation might be with them.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. If it's a woman and we might talk, I mean, not that I would just go up and start talking about pay inequalities, but there would be, there would be some common bridges, I guess is the word, some bridges. And that's just me, I'm a certain age.
Do you want more questions?
Yes.
I have something to say about that. So I think that, wait, I forgot. I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
What they just said it builds a bridge. So she could say to a woman, "It's a bridge with
Right.
Okay, Amy, come on.
Yes, thank you. So I think that it's something that we're not quite to yet, but I think it's important that that people should be able to talk about anything they want with anybody, and they should accept that, and they should respond in a way that you feel comfortable with, and vice versa.
Because, yeah, that makes sense. Because at the end of the day, when you approach someone, you might not know initially what to talk about. Like, if you're meeting someone completely new, it might be a little nerve-wracking, but, you can build bridges pretty much with anyone. It might be a little harder with some people, but it is possible. What's up?
Where do you want to go?
Is it appropriate to approach someone like you, Hugo, and just ask you, oh, do you identify as male or female or they, them? Is it, because sometimes I just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Is it inappropriate to just go ahead and ask the person?
Yeah, so I'd say, obviously, it depends on, it depends on the situation, but I'd say that's usually an appropriate thing to say. I'd say maybe don't use the term, male or female, but, are you, do you identify as a man or a woman or non-binary? Because most trans people that I know are pretty willing to, talk at least a little bit about it.
My good rule of thumb, if you think someone is with their parents and they are a minor, maybe don't ask the question, because sometimes that could be a dangerous situation for them. Other than that, ask the question. Go ahead.
Do you want this question?
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking a lot about as we've been talking about everything is just and different people have said it, but first of all, I think when it comes to approaching a new person, a lot can come from how I introduce myself. And we kind of talked about that in our small group and everything, but if I come up to someone and say hey, my name's Amelia, my pronouns are she, her, and I do that no matter who the person is, I am not 100% good at that. It's something I'm really learning and working on, and so I'm not going to say that's easy or automatic, but that can then open a conversation, because even if someone maybe doesn't want to talk about the details of their gender identity, because that can be a very complex topic that's for someone maybe they know better, they'll at least want you to refer to them the right way. And so, okay, my name's Amelia, my name is she, her. Oh, your name is Chris, your pronouns are he, him. Thank you for telling me that. And so you can kind of start out that way. And in terms of, topics and stuff, I definitely appreciate that when we see someone, we kind of try, whether it's gender or anything else, if they have a band t-shirt we like or whatever, we try and find those points of connection. But I think there's so many points of connection. If it's at church, you can talk about the sermon or about what's going to happen, or, even, and I hope you don't mind us, we have a lovely conversation before, and we talked about work, and we talked about my husband. And so you can ask what they do for work, or if they're in school. There's questions that kind of span the human experience. And I think kind of starting with those can be a really good place to start.
All right, I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit, because that brings up something good. Now, let's say you meet someone new. How do you ask their pronouns without getting weird with it? If you've never done this before, it can feel clunky and strange, but in time, it comes more naturally. So, who wants to be so brave and practice on me? I've yet to reveal my secret pronouns. Again, people who already know my pronouns. Quiet. So, who's going to be so brave and ask me? You want to go? Whatever you want to do.
Whatever's most comfortable for you.
I'm fine. Okay. Okay, so what do I do?
So, how do you think you would ask me my pronouns?
Well, based on what I've been learning today, I'd say, oh, hi, I see you're Hugo. Are you new here? I'm Suzanne Gowdy. My pronouns are she, her, and I've been here for about a year.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to go about it.
I don't do that, but that's what I learned today.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And you can always follow up with, what are your pronouns if they don't specify?
What are your pronouns, Hugo?
Yeah. So, my pronouns are they, them. So my go-to is just to be straightforward, ask for a name, ask for pronouns. Usually sometimes I say something along the lines of like, hey, I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Hugo. I use they, them pronouns. How about you? Just simple and to the point. Yeah, so...
Can I ask a question? This is the thing that's been hard for me to understand, confusing. So they, them, I think it can mean a lot of things. Like they, them can mean that you don't identify with either gender. Or they, them could mean that you do identify as a gender sometimes and not others. Or you might be doing it, as I learned from Lori, because you're supporting other people who don't use, the same pronouns.
Yeah.
So I don't even understand always when to use it or what it means. When someone tells me they use they, them, it could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't know if it's even important if I know what those reasons are.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I would say that they, them, like you said, it can mean a lot of different things. You're definitely right about that. And that would be something that, as you get to know the person better, you might ask them about. Like, you might ask them specifically how their gender experience is. I don't recommend leading with that, because it might be a little bit like, oh, okay.
Yeah, you wouldn't go up to someone and say, do you have an anxiety disorder? Like, that's kind of personal, So think about it like that. Like, you've met someone a few times and you've noticed some things. You might ask them a personal question, right? But maybe not first sentence. But asking pronouns isn't necessarily like a personal question. It's just like a normal part of interaction nowadays, if that makes sense. Okay, I think we have a question.
Do you have a brief description of the similarities and differences between trans, non-binary, and gender fluid?
Yeah, we can talk about that. So trans is kind of an umbrella term. It just basically refers to anyone whose gender identity does not match their assigned gender at birth. So basically, like when the doctor's like, it's a boy, that person might grow up and maybe like identify as a girl instead. So that is what trans can mean, but also trans could mean non-binary, which is like technically it's an umbrella term, but I won't get into that because it's a little confusing.
It's a double umbrella.
Double umbrella. So yeah, it could, so anyone who is non-binary might not necessarily identify with their assigned gender at birth. They might identify with it sometimes, or maybe a little bit, but overall, it doesn't match. So, yeah. What's up?
Gender fluid. Okay, so gender fluid is kind of like, it's like the word kind of suggests. It's when your gender kind of does this. It's like a little dance. So it's when your gender can kind of shift from time to time. The best way that I've found to explain it to people who are not gender fluid is like, you might wake up one day and you're like, I don't feel like wearing those pants, right? Or I don't feel like wearing that shirt. It's like that, but with your gender. You wake up one day and you're like, that doesn't feel quite right. It's something different today.
And that can make the pronouns thing a bit complicated, but again, as you get to know people, you can talk more about it.
Okay, so who feels prepared to ask me my name and pronouns? Anybody? Any brave takers? This is where it gets a little tricky. I'm just gonna warn you.
Does anybody?
I'm gonna be kind, don't worry, I will be very kind.
Kay's gonna do it?
Kay's gonna do it? Okay, go for it, Kay.
This is what I do. Hi. I don't know what your pronouns are.
Wonderful. So my name is James Oliver, and I use a few different sets of pronouns, actually. I use more than one set. On my church name tag, it says he, him, and they, them. I don't know if any of you have seen that. Also, sometimes I use a special thing called neopronouns. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, and we'll get into that in a minute. And I'll talk about that later. But we're just going to talk about the he, him, the they, them for a second. So, about the multiple pronouns. In my experience, people with multiple pronouns can mean a few different things, but often it means they just kind of like them both. Or all three, or all four, or all five. However many they chose, they like them all. So often it means that they want you to switch it up. You could just use he, him for me, or just use they, them for me, and that would be fine. I wouldn't be offended. Or you could switch it up. You could use he, him one sentence and they, them the next, and I'd be like, yes, this is great. I would love that. But you don't have to. You can just pick one. And that's kind of what it means. Some people, not me, but some people say that they use any, all pronouns. I'm not sure if anybody's ever heard that. But if you have, some people might say any, all. And that means you can pick whatever your heart desires. You could use he, you could use she, you could use they, you could use it if you felt like it. And they are cool with whatever. You could use these fun things called neo-pronouns we're going to talk about super briefly, just so if you come across that term, you understand what it means, and you don't get super confused. So yeah, any, all, that's basically what that means. And a lot of times people with any, all want you to get silly with it.
I wrote that line.
You did write that line. Because gender can be really fun. And I think a lot of the times when we talk about gender and trans and non-binary people, we focus on all this bad stuff. We focus on how we're oppressed. We focus on the dysphoria, and we focus how uncomfortable it can be. But it can be a really joyful experience too. When people are respectful and kind, it can be like the best part of my life. I love being trans. It makes me happy. It brings me joy. Having that gender quilt that I talked about earlier that is exactly what I want, wearing the clothing I want, having the name I want, having the pronouns I want, being respected for that, like, it brings me so much joy I cry sometimes.
That's gender euphoria, babe.
And so I think that it's important to think about that too, because not only are you avoiding bringing someone distress when you use the right name and pronouns, you could also be bringing them joy. And I think sometimes we don't talk about that.
Yeah. So we kind of already talked about sharing your own pronouns. But I want you to think a little bit. So a lot of cisgender people
Let's just find a cisgender really quick.
Yeah, cisgender means not trans. So you agree with the doctor who assigned you whatever.
So if you were born and the doctor's like, that's a girl, you're like, yep, I'm a girl. That means that's what cisgender means. Or if the doctor says, that's a boy, and you say that I'm a boy, then you're cisgender.
Yeah. So there's a lot of questions that trans people ask themselves as they're going through their gender journey. And I find it very interesting when cisgender people also ask themselves similar questions. You don't necessarily have to, I guess, become trans, but it helps you understand the trans experience a little bit more. And honestly, I think it helps you learn about everyone, because you learn to see things from different perspectives. So think about what it means to you to be a man or a woman and why that is. If you find yourself getting closed off or getting confused, you can approach those feelings with an open mind as well and ask yourself why you might be feeling that way. If you're cisgender, the question of what makes you a man or a woman probably has never really been on your radar, but it's one of the first things a lot of trans people wrestle with. Give it a try. Seeing things from trans people's point of view can be, as James Oliver mentioned, a really beautiful, fascinating, joyful, and freeing way to view the world and how trans people fit into our culture. So we already also talked about asking people their pronouns. No matter how good you think you are at telling people's gender, I hate to tell you this, but you will be wrong sometimes. Generally, it's just best to ask. Ask, and feel free to ask anyone, not just people you suspect might be trans. Part of making trans people feel safe is not singling them out. So if you just ask trans people, or if you just ask people who you are like, I think you're trans, it can feel like you're putting a spotlight on them. So asking everyone ensures clarity as well as safety. An example of this might be when someone does introductions at like a meeting, like when our chalice circle meets we do name and pronouns. Yeah, so like you can always just, if you're like leading a meeting, you can always be like, hey, name and pronouns. So yeah.
So now we're going to talk about neopronouns super briefly. I think they're fun. So neo is, I think it's Latin, right?
Don't ask me.
Latin, okay, neo is Latin for new, and pronouns are pronouns, right? So they're new pronouns. And the really cool thing about a living language is that people come up with new words all the time. I love it. Language is like one of the best things. So because we're not a dead language like Latin or whatever, we come up with new words, like slang words or non-slang words even. You know, whenever someone comes with a new company, you get a brand new name, right? When you come up with a new slang word, you get a new word. So new words are being invented every single day in living languages. So people decided, I don't really like he, she, it, or they for myself. And they said, I'm going to make a new word. And they wrote up new pronouns. So some people came up with new pronouns, and they sometimes ask people to use those pronouns for them. So you might come across people who use pronouns you've never heard of before. I'm just going to give you a couple examples. You don't have to memorize them. There's not going to be a test. Don't worry. Don't stress about it. Okay? Just some examples so you're used to hearing words that maybe you've never heard before. So the neopronouns that I occasionally use, especially with my transgender friends, are ni, nem, near. And I think they're super cute. Some other neopronouns that there are that I've heard many trans people use are fey, fair, a, air, lie, liar, and day, dare.
I love lie, liar. Our friend Vice uses it, and I think the name goes very well.
And so those are just some examples. There are probably hundreds of neopronouns at this point in different languages, because it doesn't just happen in English. People come up with new pronouns in different languages all the time because there are trans people in every single culture. Okay, I think we have a question or a comment.
Can I give a little etymology fun fact? Okay. Well, first, the neopronouns, something that helps me a lot to remember, and this is not true for all of them, but for a couple of the ones James Oliver said, it's actually just a different letter at the start of they, them, there. You know? So, I mean, use the new letter. Don't just go back to they, them, there. But in terms of, like, it's not, like, in the Cyrillic alphabet or something. There is something to kind of hang your hat on. And then also, I know that some cis people are, like, kind of new or, like, unsure about the idea of, like, identifying as cis, but the word actually comes also from Latin. I know you guys know. Comes also from Latin. Trans is the prefix that means across, like transport. And cis just means on the same side. So doctor said, baby Amelia is a girl. I have stayed on the same side of girlhood. Latin, not the most gender expansive language. So there's not really such a thing as having two sides of gender, but that's just kind of one way to think about it. It's not that someone's giving you this new identity that you have to now, like, grapple with, although it can be interesting and cool to grapple with it. It's just a word to describe what you already are, which is on the same side of the whole gender spectrum that you were to begin with.
This reminds me of way back when Ms. Magazine and Ms. came up, and we of our age, many of us, did not like the notion of being identified by our marital status. So being Miss or Mrs., which I take to be the possession of Mr., was very distasteful. But, you know, now you see when you check boxes on forms, you don't have to state, but you could state. But in a way, when I state what I state, I am signaling. And we've talked about this, and a lot of what you're talking about is signaling. But the question sometimes for people who have lived a long time is we're used to certain signals, and the signals help us build the bridges. And so when you change the signals, which we've used to our comfort, you know, to try to help us bridge, a lot of us are at sea, you know, about the signals, and then we feel everybody's uncomfortable. So it's, you know, it's a transition, no pun intended, for everybody.
I think we want to take any questions or comments now, I think is what we want to do.
I did really like that connection, though.
Yes.
yeah, so. All right, any questions?
Here you go, and then I'll come over there.
So with the cis and trans like distinctions, so I know that not everybody that's not cis is trans, and not everybody that's trans is not everybody that's not trans is cis. So is there like a different, like, is there another label for that? Like that third category kind of?
Yes. So often if you want to be inclusive, so we've been trying to keep it simple with cis and trans as being the two major categories, because they are the two major categories, though some people fall outside of those two categories, and only use the term non-binary, gender expansive, gender non-conforming. So those would be like the three other labels that people tend to use, right? Am I missing any?
I mean, there's more specific ones.
There's more specific ones,
specific.
but a lot of the times if you're using a bucket label that isn't trans or cis, it's going to be one of those three: non-binary, gender expansive, or gender non-conforming.
Yeah.
But most people fall into the cis or trans category.
Yeah, and like a non-binary person could identify as trans like I do. So, yeah.
So I think one of the things that helps me a little bit is not thinking about things in terms of binary, so not thinking about male and female, but either creating a kind of a column in between those in my mind, or taking away the hard line between them and keeping it like open between them. But I'm wondering if you guys are going to leave us with some resources, like some podcasts that we can listen to. I have also found that exposure helps that comfort piece immensely. Just exposure, whether I'm talking to somebody who's different than I am, or I'm listening to people who are different than I am, and just constantly hearing different perspectives and different experiences really helps my comfort level a lot. So I'm wondering if you'll have any resources for us. Fingers
We don't have any like printed out or anything right now, but if you want to give us your email, we can email you some later, if that works. Yeah. Okay.
I also have some videos that was done by, I think they were, I'm not sure if they're Unitarian or if it's just, but it is done by people just giving examples of what it's like to either have the microaggression, used against them using the pronouns, and then they talk about it. And they're about 10-minute long videos. So today's session is being recorded. It will be put up onto YouTube on our channel, and I will put those links to those other videos in the descriptions of this video.
I think a good way to look at it when you were asking about when you're trying to like say we need to think about like non-binary and like the words are there. Hold on, train of thought still at the boarding station. I think a good way to understand gender is as a spectrum, rather than because if you walk outside and you look at a rainbow, do you see bold black lines between each color? No, you don't. They blend. Same with like a painting. It's like they blend. Sometimes they blend, sometimes they don't. And so it's just like I think that's a good way to look at gender. Would you agree with that? Yeah.
Oh, I just want to super duper quick. Molly, whose last name I don't remember right now, but who's one of the leaders of our trans support group. She is the audio editor of a podcast called Allyship is a Verb, and I have found it very helpful, and it's on Spotify.
Kind of to tack on to what Chris was saying, tell me if I'm right or wrong in my thinking here. Like, I think of sex as being a spectrum and gender as being a separate spectrum. And is that like the right way to think about it? And like, not that you have to even fall within either of those spectra, but I don't know. I feel like that's how I've been thinking for a long time, and I don't hear people talking about that much at all. And do I have that right? I don't know.
I think you have it exactly right, actually. Viewing gender as a spectrum can be very, very helpful. So yeah, I really like that. And actually, not everyone knows this, but sex is a spectrum too. There are individuals who are called intersex, which means they don't really fall into strict categories of male and female. And they're not treated particularly well by the medical system, but that's a whole nother story.
I just wanted to share something related to that idea of signaling and sort of, yeah, I've heard that from a few different places, that idea of, well, I'm just so used to, well, are you a man or a woman, and how can I make sense of that? And I loved that connection back to that Ms. versus Miss and Mrs. So I have young kids, and as they're getting older, my oldest is 6, there's a lot of, within school and everything, like boys and girls, and I've noticed my own discomfort as he currently is male identifying, like things that as he's getting older, when he wants to wear pink, or if he ever wanted to wear a dress, like just noticing that for myself, like, wait a minute, like that should be fine, like it, and so just kind of thinking about that idea of like, kind of back to that question you answered, like what does it mean to you to identify as female or male? And like, what does it really signal if you think of them as male or female? And, again, I feel like seeing that with my young kids and what sort of boxes that puts them into. And that's been really helpful for me in sort of expanding that view.
That's really great, thank you.
And I just had one last comment that I kind of wanted to leave everyone with.
I have a last comment too.
To
leave off your section.
So no matter who you are, the only person whose gender you can really understand is your own. And the only person whose pronouns you can change is your own. And you have the right to understand your own gender and the right to change your own pronouns. You have the right to do those things, and you have the right to never do those things. You have that autonomy, and while you have that autonomy, everyone else also has that autonomy. So I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind.
So my closing thoughts are a bit heavier. I know I said I wouldn't talk about too much heavy stuff, but first of all, thank you for being such lovely participants. I love the discussions that we had. I was a little bit nervous that people would be very shy, but yeah, you did great. I hope you learned something and helped other people learn too. One last thing I'd like to emphasize before you go. Pronouns are not the end-all be-all of being a trans ally. This is just like some of the beginning courtesy stuff. It's like learning just like trans manners. But trans people are everywhere, pretty much, are under attack by oppressive systems that would rather we not exist. The situation in a lot of places can best be described using words like dire, terrifying, even deadly. And adding in complexities like intersecting identities like race, sexuality, religion, adding that to the mix creates layers that I would be remiss to not mention at all today. But they are also outside of the scope of today's discussion and time frame. But yeah, so please look into more ways to support us. If you want us to send you some resources, we can do that. Just give us your email. So yeah, we'll be happy to give you some ideas. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Hugo and James Oliver. I asked them a couple months ago if they'd be willing to do this. After they had offered to do it last fall, so I was like, we'll take you up on that. If you did not see the workshop that I did 2 weeks ago, which talks about the political landscape of transgender, I recommend watching that on YouTube. Also, in March, we're starting a 6-week series on transgender inclusion in congregations. And it's offered Sunday afternoons as a discussion and Mondays on Zoom so that if you don't want to have to be here, you can do it online. It consists of, you're going to watch a 45 to 50-minute lecture on video at your own time, whenever you have the chance to, and then you have the discussion with the discussion groups. So it's an hour on Sunday afternoon or an hour on Zoom. The email that I sent out this past week about adult education and youth education, there's a link on there for how to register. You can register either online or for the in-person. And watch for the information that comes out for the next couple of weeks talking more about it. But we really recommend that our idea is to try to get as many people as possible to participate in these classes. We'll be offering it, if you can't do it this time, we'll be offering it again next fall and some other times, because we really feel it's a very important topic and something that we need to deal with within our church. So this has kind of been a series on transgender. So I did transgender 2 weeks ago, we got transgender pronouns today, and then the trans inclusion in congregations workshops. So this has been kind of a trying to get everybody interested, piquing your interest into taking the 6-week series. So it'll be March 10th, 6 weeks with skipping Easter weekend, and then so 3 weeks in March, 3 weeks in April.
All right, cool. And if you have any additional questions, you think of anything, we're approachable, I guess. I suppose. I'm trying not to be intimidating. So, yeah.